baton here to Vanina.
Thank you, Jack. And thank you for the Institute of the Americas for inviting me and organizing today's conference. As Jack mentioned, my name is Vanina de Verneuil. I'm a senior associate at Shearman Sterling. I represent both corporate and financial institutions in a wide variety of cross-border financing and M&A transactions. I've worked in the Americas, Europe, and I've been based in China since 2007. As a Colombian living and working in Beijing, I spearhead the firm's China Latin America initiative, so I'm really happy to be here today. As we've heard today and will continue to hear, it's really hard to overestimate the importance that China has on Latin America and Latin America has on China, especially given the US and European financial crises and the way they've affected the flow of capital between emerging economies. Over the last decade, trade between Latin America and China has grown astronomically, and China outbound investment into Latin America has also significantly increased. Now, both of these have been primarily driven by China's need for Latin America's abundant natural resources and commodities. However, there's been a lot less attention given to Latin American companies investing into China, so it's great that today's conference covers that important subject. A recent study done by the Interdevelopment Bank shows that between 2006 until mid-2012, Latin American FDI into China was approximately $850 million US, with Brazil constituting the major player, major investor, approximately 37% of that amount, followed by Argentina, Mexico, and Chile. Now, $858 million isn't a huge amount, and there are discrepancies between different FDI data, but it is indicative of a trend that we hope will continue to increase with more and more Latin American companies investing into China. So what I wanted to do today was two things. The first one is kind of give you an overview of who these companies are, why they enter China, how they enter China. And the second thing is give you feedback from a trip I did last month where we visited our major corporates and financial institutional clients in both Colombia and Brazil, and we talked to them about China and Latin America and the connection. And what we did is we took that feedback and we mixed it in with our experience of inbound transactions and came up with a list of elements that are common to successful inbound transactions and a list of elements that are common to unsuccessful inbound transactions. So first, who are these Latin American companies? Well, what's interesting is that their industries and their sectors are quite varied. So if we look at it by volume, the first one is the manufacturing sector. So automobile part producers, food and beverage, chemical manufacturers, steel manufacturers. The second sector is service sector, transportation, IT, software, consulting. And then the third sector is petroleum and mining. Why did these Latin American companies come into China? Well, obviously, the reason is going to depend on their industry and on their specific objectives, but there are common reasons for entering. One being a larger global footprint, expanding into the Chinese market. A second one, wanting to differentiate themselves from their competitors. And then the third one is following their clients into China. How do they come into China? Again, it'll vary depending on the industry and the objectives, but we can see greenfield investments, such as setting up a rep office, joint ventures with Chinese partners, and we'll often see joint ventures in industries where it's restricted in China, and you need to be partnered up with a Chinese entity. Acquisitions of a foreign firm that's already operating in China or a Chinese firm in China. Three examples. First one is Brazil's Vale, which is actually one of our clients. And now Vale is the world's largest producer of iron ore and iron ore pellets. And their story in China is actually quite interesting because they were the first Latin America firm to set up a rep office in Shanghai in 1973. So their history in China has been very, very long. And starting from about 2001 onwards, they set up a series of joint ventures with Chinese steel manufacturers. They've had a lot of success in China, with China being now their dominant market. A second example is Mexico's Grupo Bimbo, which is the world's third largest baked goods company. And their story is super interesting because before they went into China, they decided to do a lot of market research. So they hired Chinese immigrants in Mexico to do a taste test of all of their baked goods. And based on that taste test, they came up with 5 initial products to enter the market. Unfortunately, despite all of their research, they quickly realized that their products were too sweet for the Chinese palate. So they had to adapt, revise, and completely revamp their product line and come up with a product line just for the Chinese palate. So meat pastries, pastries with bean paste, things that are very, very popular in China. So it's a great example of adaptation and flexibility. A third example is Mexico's Namek, which is an auto part producer. And they're a great example of following your client into China. So they entered the market when they realized that most of their clients, BMW, Hyundai, Ford, all of them had already set up production facilities in China. Also a good example of an globalized industry, such as the automobile industry, where it becomes actually pretty critical to be in the Chinese market. So these examples are brief, but it does give an idea of the possibilities of entering the market, which are quite endless. And it provides also an idea of some pitfalls. But I think for the pitfalls, what I'll do is I'll go into the elements in successful transactions and elements common in unsuccessful transactions. So for successful transactions, we've noticed three things. One, if the industry is encouraged or permitted in China, great probability of success. Second element is if the foreign entity is sophisticated and or experienced in cross-border transactions, obviously also increases the probability of a successful inbound transaction. And the third is if the foreign investor already has a presence in China and or existing relationships with the Chinese government or with regulatory authorities. Three elements common to unsuccessful inbound transactions. Well, the first one is obviously if the industry is restricted or prohibited in China, then your regulatory hurdles are obviously going to be higher. The second one is if the foreign investor is not very sophisticated in cross-border transactions or hasn't really internationalized. In that case, the timetable and execution will be a little bit more complex. And the third example, which I find the most interesting, and we hear a lot about, but really delve into the details, is language and cultural barriers. So what do I mean by language and cultural barriers? I'll give you 4 examples. The first one is a lack of mutual understanding, which leads to embedded fear and apprehension. So a great example of this is when we were in Colombia, we spoke to Ecopetrol, which is Colombia's largest petroleum company and one of Latin America's largest companies. So they recently went to China and did a roadshow, and they met with the Chinese SOEs and the Chinese corporates. And during some of the meetings, they were asked, "Excuse me, but where is Colombia geographically located?" It's an extreme example, but it is a recent and real example, and it's illustrative of a general lack of understanding and knowledge, which leads to fear and apprehension in terms of entering into cross-border transactions. A second example is what I like to call China's unique power structure. So what do I mean by that? I mean that in China, sometimes the highest level executive will not necessarily be the person with the decision-making power. Also, sometimes in negotiation sessions, you'll have a negotiation group, but no one in that group will be able to make a decision. So for Latin American entities, it can be quite frustrating. They don't understand who they're supposed to be talking to, why they're negotiating, if they don't have the decision-making power. So it can lead to a lot of confusion if you're not aware of the differences. A third example is negotiation style and tactic. So to generalize, in Latin America, usually when you negotiate, it's very linear. So you'll have one party here and one party here, and you'll negotiate and end up in the middle, and then you're good to go. In China, normally you have a very circular way of negotiating. So the Chinese will go to one term, negotiate it, discuss it. You'll think it's over, and then they'll go to something else, and then they'll come back and they'll want to re-clarify it and renegotiate it. So you can imagine it's caused a lot of frustration and confusion. It could lead a sense to a lack of transparency of why is this being renegotiated. So it becomes very important to have advisors that are aware of these strategies and are aware of the differences in order to kind of bridge the gap. The fourth example is language. Now, language is a multifaceted barrier, I would say. First of all, for example, if you don't have a common language, so Latin America, China, English is not a common language, you usually need a translator. So we've heard horror stories from our clients on certain transactions where they've worked with translators that try to negotiate for them or selectively translate or translate incorrectly. And in some we've heard of stories where they fall asleep because they're exhausted during the process. And even if you do have an amazing translator who's doing his or her work, really well, there's only a certain extent that it can be helpful, because a lot of things in the deal execution process and in negotiation get lost in translation. So you can't translate directly culture, tactic, different ways of doing business. So again, it becomes very important to have advisors that are aware and have experience with both regions. Language is also important in terms of timetable and in terms of costs. So if you need a translator and you need to translate your documentation, you're looking at a longer timetable and you're looking at higher costs. One thing I want to add here in talking about language and culture is that we talk about Latin America and we talk about China. But Latin America is a region with many, many countries, some of which speak Spanish, others which speak Portuguese. And China is a vast country with many dialects and different business customs depending on the region. So you're looking at another layer of complexity with language and cultural barriers. So how do we increase mutual understanding? How do we bridge these two gaps? Well, one thing is conferences like today, research institutes, government to government, business associations that link Latin America and China are extremely important. Financial advisors, legal advisors that understand the regions, have worked in the regions, speak the language are also very important. And I want to conclude by saying that in any relationship, whether it's between two people or between two companies, it's much easier to be in a relationship with someone that speaks your language and shares your culture, and much more difficult to be in a relationship where you don't have the same language and you don't share a culture. I'd say that those relationships tend to be more rewarding, but they're definitely more challenging. And it becomes crucial and important that both parties are open, flexible, and willing to adapt. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Vanina. That was great. I'm going to start actually with a question for you, Vanina, on the lost in translation factor.
Yes.
And I think most of the clients that we advise going into China, we always kind of jokingly around talk about one of my favorite movies, which is the Bill Murray movie Lost in Translation, which is this American movie star. He's going to Japan and he doesn't speak the local language. It's his first trip, or one of his first trips to Japan, and his handlers don't speak English, and he's just getting towed around all over Japan, doesn't know what's going on. There's a lot of conflict, confusion. The first two C's are just all over the place, and it's a satirical look at that kind of lost in translation factor. When I think of Latin American companies, you mentioned several of them. It's Latin America is a long way from China. I mean, Southern California is a long way from China. It's a 13, 14-hour flight from Los Angeles and San Francisco. If you're coming from Sao Paulo, Brazil, it's a 24-hour plus transit. So logistically, putting people on the ground and people that understand the local cultures, etc., it's a more daunting task. There's more cost involved. The pool of people with the skill set to go into those countries, I think, in some of these countries is small, and it's growing, but it's challenging to find these people. So I guess my question to you is, of the companies that you see going into China, from Colombia, Brazil, you mentioned some other countries that you had visited in Latin America, and given your background there, what is the most preferred successful route for these companies to enter the Chinese market? Is it are they working kind of with teams on the ground, setting up a local entity as a first step? Are they hiring local people? What from a legal advisor perspective, seeing companies go over there and raising capital and conducting joint ventures and or supply agreements for iron ore, for example, you mentioned Vale. Right. Vale's been there, as you mentioned, a long time. So I guess my question is, what are the key elements for a Latin American CEO that wants to go into China, that's not in China now, to set up his business or his or her business in China, from your perspective?
Well, I would say, definitely one of the main factors is the industry. So if we're looking at an industry that's encouraged in China, then the process is going to be a lot easier. So I'd say the first thing really is aligning their interests and their objectives to make sure that it's compatible with what China is permitting or encouraging at that time in terms of inbound investment. So that's one that's very important. The second one is obviously depending on whether their industry, if they just want to get to know the market better, then they could start off with a rep office. If they actually want to become more involved and have the capacity and the capital, then they could do a joint venture. with a Chinese entity. So Valley is a great example. They came in early, got really familiar with the market, and then once they had that familiarity and had done their diligence and understood the market, then they did joint ventures with different Chinese partners. Grupo Bimbo, which I mentioned earlier, they actually entered directly with an acquisition, but their industry is obviously different. It's baked goods, so there aren't that many restrictions in China, and they also had the capacity and the capital and the know-how to set up their production facilities in China right away. So it really does depend on the industry, the company's specific objectives, and how the government at that time is directing, encouraged, and permitted industries in China.
And Stephanie, I think this